Okay, so welcome to the One Omaha Fiscal Sponsorship Workshop for 2025. Okay, so today we're going to go over just sort of like fiscal sponsorship in general, but we're going to mainly focus on the types of fiscal sponsorship that One Omaha provides. So in general, fiscal sponsorship is a relationship between a 501c3 and an unincorporated organization that is mission aligned. So fiscal sponsorship can include taking on the responsibility of receiving and administering charitable contributions on behalf of the sponsored organization. Some fiscal sponsors perform other administrative, like back of the house tasks. One Omaha does not. But in general, fiscal sponsorship agreements can look different and there is no one size fits all. So just because One Omaha's fiscal sponsorship works a certain way doesn't mean that other fiscal sponsorships will. And then the vice versa is true of that as well. Ours is not going to look like maybe some other fiscal sponsorships that you've seen before. So what does our fiscal sponsorship look like? So One Omaha's fiscal sponsorship is for local groups that are looking to secure funds for community projects that improve or strengthen our city and neighborhoods. The reason that we developed our fiscal sponsorship is because equitable access to grant funding can support a healthier ecosystem for neighborhood groups and put people in a place to make change from the bottom up. So basically, we just wanted to remove a barrier that a lot of groups were identifying in receiving funds, which was having that 501c3 status. So the One Omaha fiscal sponsorship is for resident-led, neighborhood-based groups whose mission is aligned with One Omaha's mission. Our mission is to empower people where they live through education, training, and engagement to build thriving neighborhoods. So we can be a fiscal sponsor for groups that are looking to build thriving neighborhoods through education, training, and engagement. Reasons that you would use a fiscal sponsor is that fiscal sponsors allow you to receive funding without having to build some of the back of the house aspects of a nonprofit or of an organization. So instead of having to have your own administrator or go through the entire process of getting your 501c3 status, a fiscal sponsor allows you to spend your time focusing on the work that you intend to do. And I guess another point there is that some fiscal sponsors, some groups that are fiscally sponsored will eventually become their own nonprofit. And so they're using fiscal sponsorship as like a stepping stone so that they can, do the work now, but eventually they'll have their own entity. And other groups will just use fiscal sponsorship the entire time that the organization is active. And that's fine too. There's even, really large organizations that, actually grant out money that use fiscal sponsors in perpetuity. So there's nothing about, fiscal sponsorship can be a stepping stone, but it can also just be it can be your strategy moving forward as well. Okay, so One Omaha has 4 major buckets of fiscal sponsorship types. And each fiscal sponsorship type has a different fee associated with it. The fees that are associated with fiscal sponsorship are for the administrative work that goes along that One Omaha staff has to perform to complete the fiscal sponsorships. So our first type of fiscal sponsorship is where we started, which is neighborhood grants. So there's 2 neighborhood grants, the Omaha Neighborhood Grant Program, ONGP, that's put on by the Omaha Community Foundation. And then there's the Omaha Mayor's Neighborhood Grant, which is put on by the mayor's office. So for both of these grants, One Omaha can provide fiscal sponsorship to groups that don't have a bank account or a 501c3 status. For the Omaha Neighborhood Grant Program, you don't need to be a nonprofit to receive that funding, but you do need to have an organizational bank account. So if your organization doesn't have a bank account, One Omaha can serve as a fiscal sponsor in that case. For the mayor's grant, you do have to have a nonprofit status, and so if you lack that, One Omaha can serve as a fiscal sponsor in that case. So there's no fee associated with this fiscal sponsorship. And it's pretty straightforward. We'll receive the funding on behalf of the group, and then the group will disperse the funds to the group, and the group is responsible for managing the funds, making purchases, and correctly reporting on the project to both One Omaha and the funding entity. We provide a really similar type of fiscal sponsorship for other grants. So similar to the neighborhood grants, for other grants like the African American Unity Fund or the Futuro Latino Fund, even the Whites Family Foundation or Sherwood Foundation, we can provide fiscal sponsorships for those types of grants as well. And it's really similar. We'll receive the funds on behalf of the group and then disperse the funds to the group, who is then responsible for managing the funds, making purchases, and all reporting requirements to both One Omaha and the funding entity. There's a 5% fee associated with this type of fiscal sponsorship. Then there's an administrative fiscal sponsorship, and that can be for any type of grant that you're receiving. And that's where One Omaha receives the funds on behalf of the organization and then also handles the administrative functions of that grant. So that could be paying out contractors, making other required purchases to complete the project. And so in that case, One Omaha is taking a larger role in the completion of that project through making all of the purchases. So when this happens, there's a 10% fiscal sponsorship fee associated with this because it is a lot more involved work. And the group's required to provide a list of all the contractors to be paid out and purchases that need to be made 10 days in advance of those purchases needing to be made. And then they're also required to have a check-in with One Omaha staff every 2 weeks to stay up to date on the project. And then there's what we have called a fundraiser fiscal sponsorship. And this is for a group that wants to be able to either receive donations or host a fundraiser in which folks can receive tax-deductible donation receipts for their donations. So if that's a fundraiser that somebody is, and so there's a couple reasons you might want to do a fundraiser. One is if folks are going to donate large amounts of money, like $500, $1,000, and they can donate it to a nonprofit, then One Omaha can provide a tax-deductible donation receipt for them. And then the other reason is just for the legitimacy of the fundraiser. If instead of doing it on GoFundMe or something, if you want to have it on a fundraiser platform so that it's like understood. Sometimes I think GoFundMe is a little bit more for like immediate needs. And so to have that like kind of line of like, this is a group raising funds for a project. It's not necessary, but we can provide that fiscal sponsorship for you. There's a 10% fee associated with a fundraiser fiscal sponsorship. And there's extra steps that are required as well. Ahead of the time, the group will meet with One Omaha staff and decide on the length of time that the fundraiser will run. If you want to use fundraising software, we'll use the One Omaha fundraising software, which is Kindful. And then One Omaha staff will provide you either weekly or bi-weekly updates on the fundraiser. So if you're wondering like, hey, how much have we raised so far? Like you'll set up a schedule where it's like every Friday, One Omaha will email you and let you know what what the fundraiser progress is. And then at the end of that fundraiser, the funds can either go through an administrative process or One Omaha can disperse the funds directly to the group, who is required to also complete a fiscal sponsorship report on how those funds were used. So like I said, 10% fee associated with that type of fiscal sponsorship. And you can see that the administrative and fundraiser fiscal sponsorship have extra steps associated with them. But generally, the process for fiscal sponsorship is more or less the same for each type of fiscal sponsorship. So the first step is to become familiar with One Omaha's fiscal sponsorship. And the way you do that is by watching this workshop. And then the second step is to submit a fiscal sponsorship request form for each project. So on our website, there is a fiscal sponsorship request form, which I'll send to everybody after this workshop. And One Omaha does what's called project-based fiscal sponsorships. So if you are, if you have two projects that you're going to do that year, and one project is like face painting for kids, and the other project is youth civic engagement classes, then you would create a fiscal sponsorship request for the project face painting for kids. And on that fiscal sponsorship request form, you would indicate all of the different grants that you're applying for that project. So if you're applying for both the ONGP and the mayor's grant for this face painting for kids, you just complete one fiscal sponsorship request form for the project, and then you indicate all of the different grants that you will be applying to for that project. Now, if you have a different project, which is going to have a different budget and different goals, then you would complete a different fiscal sponsorship request form for an additional project in which you would also indicate all of the different grants that you were going to apply for that second project. So for the youth civic engagement classes, is that the example I used for kids? You might be applying to the Sherwood Foundation or to Union Pacific for funding for those projects. So different projects, different budgets, different goals equals different fiscal sponsorship request forms. So you submit a fiscal sponsorship request form. On your request form, indicate each type of grant that you'll be applying for that project. And then I will receive that fiscal sponsorship request form and I'll read through it. And then I'll get back to you within 48 hours. And I'll reach out to arrange a follow-up meeting. In that follow-up meeting, we'll work out the details of the request and what additional information will need to be provided. So if it's just a straightforward, project fiscal sponsorship, there'll still be a lot of details to work out. I might have some questions, asking you to flesh out the budget, or, if it feels like your project, is related to neighborhoods, but that's not well articulated in the request form, I might ask you to elaborate on that. So we'll really work out a lot of details. We'll figure out, if you're not sure if it's going to be an administrative fiscal sponsorship or something like that. We'll really just kind of flesh out the complicated parts of a fiscal sponsorship in that meeting. So if you're feeling like you're not exactly sure what's gonna, what it looks like from there on out, that meeting is the thing where everything becomes a little bit more clear. So if it's like a fundraiser fiscal sponsorship, that's where we'll figure out, well, like how long is the fundraiser gonna run and how frequently do you want the progress updates? So really great meeting where we get a lot of work done. And then, like I said, you might be asked to provide a little bit more information out of that. And then after that comes the approval process. So for grant requests under $5,000, the request will need staff approval. So if you're going to apply for 2 neighborhood grants for a total of $10,000, but each neighborhood grant is $5,000, then both of those grants would receive staff approval. However, if you're going to ask for $10,000 from one grant, say from like Logier, then any fiscal sponsorships over $5,000, those require board approval. That is the way that we do it, and I think the main reason behind that is just to make sure that when we're fiscally sponsoring large projects, that the entire organization is taking a look at that project. And just making sure that it does align with our mission. So for staff approval, it takes, usually less than 48 hours, but sometimes up to 48 hours to receive staff approval, 48 business hours, or, 2 business days. And for board approval, it can take a little bit longer. Usually we can get that done in about 3 days, though. So after you receive approval, then you'll sign a contract for every type of fiscal sponsorship request. So like I said, if you have the one project for face painting, but you're applying for the mayor's grant to fund that face painting project, and you're applying to the Omaha Neighborhood Grant Program to fund that project, then we'll sign 2 contracts. We'll sign one contract for the fiscal sponsorship for the mayor's grant and one contract for the fiscal sponsorship for the Omaha Neighborhood Grant Program. So the request forms are project-based, but the contracts are based on each grant that One Omaha is serving as a fiscal sponsorship for. And then, the reason that there is so much of that, of like what all these different contracts, is just to make sure that we're keeping everything super straight. We're fiscally sponsoring lots of projects, and we need to be able to easily look back and recall the details of a certain fiscal sponsorship or a certain project. So it's not meant to be cumbersome. It's just meant to make sure that everything stays smooth and well understood for everyone involved the whole way through. Okay, so after you sign your contract, then One Omaha will provide you with the information that you need to complete your application. So usually that's a tax ID number and an address. Sometimes it'll also be a IRS certification of nonprofit status. So whatever, you'll let me know what you need for your application, and I'll provide you with that information. I won't provide you with that information before we sign the contract. I will provide you with that information after we sign the contract. So then you're waiting to hear back about you did all this and you're still waiting to hear back about whether or not you're going to be funded. And you are responsible for alerting One Omaha whether or not you have received funding. So when you hear back from the funding source, then you email me and you let me know, like, hey, we didn't receive the funding this time, or like, great news, we did receive the funding and it's supposed to arrive, within 30 days, or it's supposed to arrive next week. And what you'll want to tell me is, when it's supposed to arrive and how it's supposed to arrive. So if it's going to be a direct deposit into a bank account, or if it's going to be a check that's sent in the mail, if you can let me know those things, it will be easier for me to process your fiscal sponsorship. So you're responsible for letting me know that the funding is, that whether or not you've received funding, and also how and when it will arrive. If 15,000 extra dollars shows up on our bank account from the Whites Foundation and I haven't heard from anyone, we'll refund that money to the Whites Foundation. So it is the responsibility of the sponsee to keep a lookout for whether or not funding will be received and when and how it will be received. And then if we have an administrative fiscal sponsorship or a fundraiser, that's usually where we do the extra steps of like setting up the biweekly meetings and maybe fleshing out the budget a little further. And then after you've received your funding and you've successfully done your project, you need to complete a final report. This says December 15th, 2026. It's supposed to be January 15th, 2026. So you'll complete a final report by January 15th, 2026. If your project goes a little bit past that, you'll still complete a final report for the year of 2025. And in that final report, you'll just let us know that like the project is still ongoing. If you don't complete a final report, that can result in the inability to receive fiscal sponsorships in the future, and even the possibility of you having to reimburse the funds to the funding entity. So really important to complete that final report. Okay, so we talked about how there might be additional steps after you have the success of receiving the grant. So the additional steps involved with the fundraiser type of fiscal sponsorship is that, we'll have a follow-up meeting after your original request. We'll decide what frequency you want the funds dispersed from the fundraiser. We'll decide what frequency you want to be updated on the fundraiser, how long it'll go. Then we'll set up the fundraiser using Kindful, and then we'll also set up biweekly meetings to check in. And then you'll be responsible for promoting that fundraiser. If it's an administrative fiscal sponsorship, additional steps is that after the follow-up meeting, you'll share, I'll probably ask you to give, I might ask for a more detailed outline of your budget, just since that'll be something that we'll be administrating. And so I'll want to make sure that I understand what's coming. Again, you'd be responsible for alerting staff about the disbursement of funds. And then after those funds are dispersed, then we'll meet up again. And because a lot of times it's like, there can be some time between that follow-up meeting that we have after your initial request where we flesh out the budget and timeline. Sometimes there's 90 to 120 days before you find out that you get the grants. So at that point, we'll meet again and we'll, go over your timeline and your budget again. Since we're administrating it, we need to, have a good idea of what projects you're doing, when we need to be expecting, to make payments, and how large of checks, we're expecting to be making payment, or how we're expecting to make payments. Are we going to be writing checks? Are we going to be using PayPal? And then we'll also have to set up a process for, collecting W-9s from contractors. So those are all the additional steps that will happen after the funding has been dispersed for an administrative fiscal sponsorship. And then we'll also set up, this is bi-weekly meetings to check in on upcoming payments and any other needs that might need to be addressed. Okay, so just to review, One Omaha does not serve as a fiscal sponsorship in perpetuity. Just because we've approved a past fiscal sponsorship doesn't mean that we are just a fiscal sponsor in perpetuity. We need to address each fiscal sponsorship request individually. So, there's, a few folks that we do serve as a fiscal sponsor for, all of their grant requests, but they always submit a request form for each for each project. And then if, it's the same project, but they're still trying to fund it a year later, they'll resubmit a request form just to kind of let us know, like, because, if those grants aren't included on the original request form. So like I said, you also need to submit a request form for each different project. You'll sign a contract for each distinct grant, each distinct fiscal sponsorship. And, even if we've had good discussions and it's clear that, your work is super aligned with One Omaha's mission and you always get approval for your fiscal sponsorships, you still need to submit a request the following year. We've had situations where, I guess the reason I need to make this really clear is that we've had situations where money shows up in our bank account and we have no idea that it's coming. That's why we, ask people to resubmit or to always be submitting these different fiscal sponsorship requests, is so that we can make sure that we're making sure that funding's getting to the people that have received, have applied for it and been lucky to receive it. Okay, so when we're talking about approval, what are we looking for to receive approval for fiscal sponsorship? First thing is going to be mission alignment. We cannot fiscally sponsor organizations that are not aligned with One Omaha's mission. So you need to let us know how your work builds resilient communities, how it educates, trains, or engages residents, and it needs to be resident-led at the neighborhood level. There's a lot of, high-level, super impactful, important work that is done by residents at the neighborhood level. So that, it doesn't mean that it can only be like bake sales and block parties. It just has to be something that is done on the neighborhood level. So, engaging people at bake sales and block parties. So we need to have that mission alignment. If we don't have mission alignment, most likely what I'll do is direct you to other fiscal sponsorship opportunities that might be more aligned. And then that, to be said is like, there's been, cases where it's like somebody wanted to travel abroad to get education on a certain topic. And they said, once I get this education, I'm going to bring it back and share it with residents, at this neighborhood level. And it was like, okay, well, you going to get the education, that's professional development. And since it's not specifically related to the classes, to the education being shared, because you can, receive an education and still not share it out. Um, since in this case, they were asking for funding to go receive the education, that didn't align with resident-led neighborhood level engagement because they were going to another country to receive this education. But it's great professional development. So we, sent them to different fiscal sponsor that was more able to cover like professional development for that sort of thing, and said, when you come back and you need to develop that educational series, or you want to implement that educational series at the neighborhood level, we could be a fiscal sponsor for that project because that project aligns with our mission. So, if you don't have mission alignment, we'll work hard to find you somebody that does. And then we look at the budget. So, if you have really good mission alignment and a great narrative, and then for your budget, you say $5,000 for supplies, and it doesn't make sense how those supplies are being used to accomplish the goals, that's something that, could lead to not receiving approval. So you want to make sure that you have a fleshed out budget, that your budget correlates to your project goals. So if you're asking for, money to give stipends to people for teaching education classes, you want to make sure that you have a goal of educating people. So then we want to see that you have a detailed budget so that, and what we mean by detailed budget isn't like every single cent. What we mean is that the budget shows that what is included in the budget is necessary to accomplish the project, and that there's a good understanding of what is necessary to accomplish this project, that we can see that it will happen. It's not vague. It's a thing that's going to happen. And then we also want to see that the project's feasible with the amount of money requested and the timeline suggested. So, if you say that you're going to educate 5,000 folks on civic engagement in 4 months with a budget of $2,000, we might follow up with some extra questions about that. Okay, so just to go over the information that is asked on the fiscal sponsorship request form, you're gonna need 3 contacts. What we wanna see is, resident-led, community-supported neighborhood groups. So that's why we're not supporting just, one individual's idea. We're supporting projects that are arrived at through group consensus. So we wanna see that there's 3 engaged residents in your project. And then we're gonna need the contacts for 3 members. And then we want you to tell us about your group. So just give us a short history, 2 to 5 paragraphs. It doesn't need to be too long. Just needs to explain, who are you? What is the, why do you do the work that you do? How did you all come to the work that you do? And like, what are some of the successes that you've had in the past? And then we're going to want a general description of the project, just a who, what, when, where, why, 5 paragraphs. So explain to us in this, in this general description of the project, this is going to be a good place to just kind of give general goals, how you decided on this project, and then, why you're doing it. And then we're gonna wanna see a timeline. So this again is, we wanna see that like this project's gonna happen, that it's gonna happen within the amount of time that, the grant is that you're gonna have the grant funding. So it doesn't have to be super detailed, but it does, we do wanna see like a list of steps, and ideally a month by month timeline of like when those steps will happen, or even just like quarterly if you're applying for like a grant that you know sometimes grants, it's like the timeline for receiving and using the funding is 6 months. Sometimes it can be, 12 months or 18 months. If it's gonna be an 18-month project, we can do like a quarterly timeline. If it's a 6-month project, we wanna see a little bit more like month by month. And then we want a description of who will benefit from this project, how many people, where do they live, and how exactly will they benefit. If it feels repetitive to some of the things you already wrote, that's okay, as long as it's true. And then we'll want to see a general budget. So I think a good way to do this is to like create a spreadsheet and then just copy and paste, item, cost, and you can do item cost and then like how those how the budget items are going to help you to accomplish your goal. And then finally, we have a question about how this project will help to further One Omaha's mission. So this is where you get to explain how your mission aligned with One Omaha. So, focus on how, you're doing things on the neighborhood level, how residents are involved, how leadership development will be gained from this, education, training, and engagement. Doesn't need to be too long, just needs to be clear and concise. If you can explain it in 3 sentences, that's great. If it takes you 10 paragraphs, probably want to shorten that. So it doesn't need to be too long, it just needs to be correct. And by correct, I mean it just needs to align. Okay, and so then a little bit into depth about the contracts. You'll sign a contract for each grant request, like I said. So if you have your project, and you're going to apply from 2 different funding sources for this project, you'll sign a contract for each funding source. The main information that's outlined in the contract is the fiscal sponsorship agreement, the fees that are associated with the fiscal sponsorship, the allowable activities. So One Omaha is a 501c3. Organizations that are being fiscally sponsored by One Omaha have to adhere to the same rules and regulations that 501c3s adhere to. So no direct campaigning for candidates. And if you need, information about what is and isn't, what political activities aren't allowed, then, I'm happy to provide that to you. Additionally, you know, other codes of conduct apply as well, no discriminatory policies, for our sponsees. And then other things that are outlined in the contract is the conduct and responsibilities of the sponsee. So, when to contact staff for questions, we don't want to be, you can email us around the clock, but we don't want to be getting phone calls at like 8 o'clock on a Saturday night. So making sure to contact us within office hours. Timeline for submitting invoices. You will agree to submit those invoices 10 days ahead of time to give us an opportunity to make sure that they get paid by the deadline. And you'll also agree to use One Omaha's fundraising software for any fundraising purposes. Okay, so when we get to the point of the disbursement of funds, you are responsible for understanding the grant timeline. You're responsible for understanding when funds will be dispersed and when your final report to the grantor is due. You must notify One Omaha that funds have been dispersed. We'll arrange an in-person meeting to receive your funds. So we'll figure that out once you let me know when the funds have been dispersed, and then we'll meet in person. Allow about 7 days to arrange that meeting. So, just imagine if you receive your disbursement, you receive notification that you've received funding, expect, about 7 days before you get your check. So think of that in your timing for some of your projects. And then we ask that you deposit the funds within 15 days. That way we can track that they have been deposited, and it makes it easier for our accountant. Okay, and then a final report is due by January 15th, 2026. You must complete a final report. It's not super hard. You can just let us know what went well, what was hard. We ask that you include pictures. If you'll always have to submit a final report for the grant that you received, so you can always copy and paste your final report, and give us that information. And then, in your final report, like, let us know what went well, what didn't, so we can use this information to help us develop our programming moving forward. Okay, so that is the basics of our fiscal sponsorship. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and I'll also stop the recording.